Did women in medieval Europe, shrouded in mystery and whispered tales, truly hold secret knowledge that threatened their very existence? Were ancient secrets passed down through hidden female lineages inviting danger and persecution? Let us journey back to the years 476 to 1492 and unveil the surprising realities behind these dark suspicions. Number 8. The myth of the fiery pages. Did books really seal a medieval woman's doom? A persistent whisper suggests that if a medieval woman dared to touch a book, especially one filled with unconventional wisdom, she risked facing the most severe punishment, perhaps even the searing flames of a pyre. The image of a woman huddled over forbidden texts, her face illuminated by a flickering candle, only to be discovered and condemned, is certainly dramatic. But what do the dusty annals of history truly reveal about medieval women and their relationship with written words, particularly those deemed forbidden? The idea that simply possessing books, regardless of their content, automatically led to a woman's doom in medieval Europe is a compelling narrative, yet it largely overlooks the nuanced reality of a complex society. In the early medieval period, literacy itself was a luxury confined to a small percentage of the population, mostly within the clergy or high aristocracy. The books were rare and precious objects, often handmade on vellum, making them incredibly expensive. To possess one was a sign of wealth and status, not necessarily an immediate red flag for heresy or witchcraft. Consider the role of convents. These enclosed communities were vibrant centers of learning, where women not only read books but also created them. Nunneries, like the double monastery of Whitby, under the formidable Abbess Hild in the 7th century, fostered environments where both men and women studied scripture, Latin, and even poetry. And far from being persecuted for their intellectual pursuits, these women were revered for their scholarship. The rule of St. Benedict, which guided many monastic communities, explicitly encouraged reading as a spiritual discipline. A nun named Hrotsvita of Gandersheim, living in the 10th century in what is now Germany, penned plays in Latin, drawing on classical themes but imbuing them with Christian morality. Her works were copied and circulated, not hidden away in fear. She openly engaged with the intellectual heritage of her time, showing no indication that her literary pursuits were dangerous or forbidden. Moving into the High Middle Ages, while female literacy rates outside of monastic settings remained lower than male rates, they were far from non-existent. Aristocratic women often received education, not just in household management and piety, but also in reading and writing, sometimes in multiple languages. Eleanor of Aquitaine, a powerful queen in the 12th century, was not only literate but a patron of poets and scholars. Her court was a hub of intellectual and artistic activity. Her books, including those containing romantic literature or historical accounts, were part of her world. There is no historical record suggesting that her access to or ownership of texts, even those considered secular or entertaining, brought her peril. Indeed, her power and influence were often enhanced by her intellectual acumen. Later medieval periods saw a gradual increase in literacy among urban populations, including women. Merchant wives might manage household accounts and correspondence, requiring at least basic literacy. The growth of vernacular literature also meant that books became more accessible, moving beyond Latin theological texts to include practical guides, devotional works written in common languages, and even popular romances. Marjorie Kempe, a 15th century English mystic, dictated her autobiography, a sprawling and deeply personal narrative. While her religious experiences and public behavior sometimes drew suspicion from church authorities, the mere act of creating and disseminating a written text was not the primary cause of her difficulties. Her book was considered, debated, and eventually preserved, not automatically deemed an instrument of her doom. The true focus of concern regarding books and knowledge in the medieval period was less about who possessed them and more about the content and interpretation of those texts. Heresy was a grave charge, but it stemmed from espousing beliefs contrary to church doctrine, not from simply owning a book. A woman or a man might be scrutinized for reading or promoting texts deemed heterodox, but the book itself was a symptom, not the crime. The Malleus Maleficarum, often cited as a handbook for witch hunters, itself was a book, and its authors were clerics. It contained extensive discussion of what they considered dangerous knowledge, but its existence and readership did not automatically lead to condemnation. The idea of books being forbidden was less about their physical existence and more about the knowledge they contained, or the way they were used. Works of magic or alchemy were indeed viewed with suspicion by the church, but the individuals studying them, whether male or female, were condemned for their perceived practices, not for simply having a volume on a shelf. For a medieval woman, her social standing, her family connections, her community's perception of her piety, and the specific accusations leveled against her were far more significant factors in her fate than the mere presence of a book in her possession. The myth of the fiery pages, while dramatic, misses the intricate tapestry of medieval life where women navigated their intellectual lives with a surprising degree of agency, often under the very nose of the church, and sometimes even with its blessing. The quiet rustle of parchment in a nun's cell or a noblewoman's chamber was more often the sound of learning and devotion than a prelude to disaster. Number 7. The healer's hand, not the witch's curse, unveiling the true role of medieval women in medicine. It is a pervasive thought that in medieval times, any woman who dared to possess knowledge of herbs, remedies, or the human body was immediately branded a witch, her helpful intentions twisted into sinister magic. The image of the witch doctor operating in the shadows, feared and persecuted for her healing arts, paints a bleak picture of women's contributions to health and well-being. But if we look closely at the daily lives and social structures of medieval communities, a very different picture emerges, one where female healers were often vital and respected figures. From the humblest village to the grandest castle, women were the primary caregivers for the sick and infirm. They managed household health, preparing poultices, brewing infusions, and delivering babies. This was not a clandestine activity, but a fundamental part of their domestic and communal roles. Grandmothers, mothers, and elder women passed down generations of practical knowledge about medicinal plants, basic anatomy, and first aid. This oral tradition was the backbone of everyday healthcare for the majority of the population. Their expertise was sought out, not shunned. Consider the role of the wise woman in a medieval village. She was not a solitary outcast, but an integral part of the community fabric. When a child fell ill with a fever, or a laborer suffered a broken bone, it was often the wise woman, with her intimate knowledge of local flora and traditional remedies, who was called upon. Her understanding of the natural world, cultivated through experience and observation, provided comfort and often effective relief. For example, a woman might gather feverfew for headaches, comfrey for bone mending, or willow bark for pain relief practices that predate modern pharmaceuticals but were based on tangible efficacy. These practices were viewed as practical applications of natural knowledge, not as supernatural incantations. In aristocratic households, noblewomen often had their own apothecaries and even small herb gardens, managing the health of their families and servants. They oversaw the preparation of sophisticated medicines and employed skilled female attendants who specialized in particular ailments. For instance, the renowned Abbess Hildegard of Bingen, living in the 12th century, compiled extensive botanical and medical treatises such as Physica and Causae et Curae. Her writings detail a vast array of medicinal plants, their properties, and their uses for various illnesses. She was a respected intellectual and healer, her knowledge sought by emperors and popes. Her deep understanding of natural medicine was seen as a gift from God, not a sign of forbidden pacts. Her remedies were based on observation and theory, aligned with the scientific understanding of her time. Even in urban settings, female healers often operated openly. While formal medical education in universities was largely restricted to men, many women practiced as apothecaries, barber surgeons, or simply as practitioners of domestic medicine. Some even formed guilds in certain cities, indicating a recognized professional status. In cities like Paris and Bologna, there are records of women who were licensed to practice medicine, often after demonstrating their competence. These women were not operating in fear of being accused of witchcraft simply because they healed. They were seen as legitimate practitioners filling a critical need in society. The association of all female healers with witchcraft largely emerged in the later medieval and early modern periods during the intense witch hunts. Even then, the accusations were highly specific, focusing on perceived maleficium, the use of magic to cause harm, rather than on the act of healing itself. A woman might be accused if a patient died under her care and superstitious beliefs were invoked, or if she was already marginalized or considered troublesome for other reasons. Her knowledge of herbs and remedies might then be reinterpreted through a lens of suspicion, but the initial, common understanding of her role was often one of trust and reliance. The crucial distinction lies between accepted practical knowledge and perceived malicious magic. A medieval woman who brewed a calming tea for a sleepless neighbor was simply being helpful. If that same woman was believed to have caused a neighbor's cow to sicken, and then her herbal knowledge was reinterpreted as a tool for evil, that was a different scenario. The vast majority of medieval women who engaged in healing, whether through simple household remedies or sophisticated herbal concoctions, did so as an accepted, necessary, and often honored part of their lives and communities. They were not hunted down for their wisdom, they were celebrated for their hands that brought comfort and cure. Their knowledge was not forbidden, but essential, woven into the very fabric of daily survival and well-being. So number 6, cracking the parchment code. When medieval women weren't shut out of learning, a widespread belief suggests that medieval women were universally condemned to a life of illiteracy, completely barred from the world of books, scholarship, and intellectual pursuits. The image that often comes to mind is one where knowledge was a male domain, locked away in monastic libraries and university lecture halls, inaccessible to even the most curious female mind. Yet, a deeper look into the medieval world reveals a far more complex and often surprising reality, where various avenues to learning were open to women, depending on their social standing, geographical location, and personal ambition. The most prominent centers of female learning in the Middle Ages were undoubtedly convents. These religious institutions provided an intellectual sanctuary where women could not only learn to read and write, but also engage in advanced theological study, copy manuscripts, compose original works, and even teach. For many women, particularly from noble or wealthy families, entering a convent was not merely a spiritual calling, but also a pathway to intellectual fulfillment that was otherwise unavailable. At places like the convent of Helfta in 13th century Germany, women like Mechthild of Magdeburg, Gertrude the Great, and Mechthild of Hackeborn were prolific writers and mystics. They penned deeply spiritual texts, theological reflections, and even poetry, all of which required extensive literacy and engagement with complex concepts. Their works were widely circulated within monastic networks and beyond, demonstrating their intellectual prowess and the value placed on their contributions. Beyond the cloistered walls, aristocratic women also frequently received education. While not always as formalized as male schooling, noblewomen were often taught to read and write, primarily for managing large estates, corresponding with family members, and engaging in courtly culture. A queen or a high-ranking lady needed to be able to read diplomatic letters, manage household accounts, and often entertain visiting scholars or poets. Eleanor of Provence, Queen of England in the 13th century, was known for her literacy and her patronage of the arts and literature. She maintained a personal library and encouraged learning within her court. For these women, literacy was a mark of their status and a necessary tool for exercising influence. Even in urban environments, literacy rates for women, while generally lower than for men, were not negligible, particularly among the merchant class. And daughters of prosperous merchants might learn to read and write to assist with family businesses, keep records, or manage household finances. Devotional literacy was also significant, as more women sought to read psalters, books of hours, and vernacular religious texts for personal piety. These books were often richly illuminated and passed down through generations, cherished possessions that fostered a connection to the written word. The creation of the Book of the City of Ladies by Christine de Pizan at the turn of the 15th century stands as a powerful testament to female intellectual capability and advocacy. Christine de Pizan was a professional writer, a groundbreaking figure who made her living solely from her literary work after being widowed. She challenged misogynistic narratives and celebrated women's achievements, demonstrating immense scholarship and rhetorical skill. Her work, commissioned by powerful patrons, including royal courts, shows that a woman could not only be literate, but also a respected author and intellectual voice in her own right. Her very existence refutes the notion of a universal ban on female learning. While universities remain largely exclusive to men, and formal professions like law or medicine were generally inaccessible, this did not mean women were entirely cut off from knowledge. Informal apprenticeships, household education, and the vibrant intellectual exchange within religious communities allowed many women to cultivate their minds. The emphasis on practical skills and domestic management certainly dominated the education of most women, but for a significant minority, particularly those with means or a religious vocation, the world of books and scholarship was not a forbidden territory, but a realm they actively explored and enriched. The parchment code was indeed cracked by many medieval women, leaving behind a legacy of their own words and thoughts for future generations. Number 5, the shadow sisterhood that wasn't peeking behind the veil of medieval dark magic covens. A common image painted about the medieval period is that of secret covens of women meeting under the cloak of night, whispering incantations and performing dark magic to undermine the church or society. This narrative often conjures up visions of organized groups of female sorceresses sharing forbidden knowledge and actively engaging in malevolent rituals, striking fear into the hearts of their contemporaries. However, historical evidence from the medieval era presents a much different and far less dramatic picture, revealing that the idea of widespread, organized, dark magic covens of women is largely a later construct rather than a medieval reality. The concept of a coven, as an organized group of witches dedicated to malevolent practices and anti-Christian rituals, truly took shape in the early modern period, primarily during the intense European witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries. It was then that legal and theological treatises, such as the infamous Malleus Maleficarum of 1487, began to systematically define witchcraft as a pact with the devil and describe the activities of imagined witches' gatherings, or sabbats. These descriptions were often fueled by theological anxieties, social unrest, and the interrogations of accused individuals who sometimes confessed under torture to participating in such gatherings. The narrative spun during these trials, often reflecting the fears and beliefs of the accusers and interrogators, created the enduring image of the coven. In the medieval period itself, beliefs about magic certainly existed, but they were more diffuse and less systematically organized around the idea of a satanic pact. Local folk magic, often practiced by both men and women, involved charms for healing, warding off evil, ensuring good harvests, or finding lost objects. This kind of magic was often seen as practical, sometimes superstitious, and while it might be viewed with suspicion by the church, it was generally not equated with organized, devil-worshipping covens. A woman who used a charm to heal a sick child was acting within a traditional folk context, not as part of a secret society. Accusations of witchcraft in the medieval period, prior to the widespread witch hunts, were comparatively rare and typically focused on individuals rather than organized groups. These accusations often arose from neighborly disputes, personal animosities, or misunderstandings about natural phenomena. If someone's cow sickened, or a crop failed, and a village outcast or an unpopular woman had a reputation for strange behavior, she might be blamed. These were localized incidents, not evidence of a widespread secretive sisterhood working against the established order. The focus was on maleficium, the actual harm believed to be caused by magic, rather than on adherence to a codified anti-Christian magical system. Furthermore, the very idea of a secret society of women holding vast power and operating systematically to undermine the church runs contrary to the social structures of the time. Medieval society was largely patriarchal, with established hierarchies and strong communal bonds often overseen by the church and secular authorities. Large-scale, hidden organizations would have been incredibly difficult to maintain without leaving significant historical traces. The resources, communication networks, and shared ideology necessary for such a sisterhood to function effectively on a widespread scale simply do not appear in the historical records. The fear of organized female groups often stemmed from anxieties about female autonomy or power, outside of traditional domestic and religious roles. However, the women who did form powerful groups in the Middle Ages were typically within sanctioned frameworks, like the aforementioned convents, which were often powerful landholders and intellectual centers. While these groups of women certainly wielded influence, their power was derived from their adherence to established religious and social norms, not from practicing forbidden dark arts and secret gatherings. The enduring image of the shadow sisterhood of dark magic covens is a product of later fears and literary imaginations, projected backward onto the medieval era. In reality, while individual women sometimes faced accusations of using magic for harm, the medieval landscape was not teeming with secretive female networks dedicated to systematic black magic. The daily lives of medieval women were filled with hard work, piety, and community engagement, leaving little room for or evidence of such a grand, organized conspiracy. The true veil behind the idea of these covens reveals not a hidden reality, but a powerful myth shaped by subsequent periods. Number 4, Stargazers and Number Crunchers, the surprising truth about medieval women and forbidden sciences. The popular imagination often paints medieval women as entirely disengaged from intellectual pursuits, especially those deemed sciences like astronomy, mathematics, or natural philosophy. The lingering suspicion is that any woman daring to delve into such subjects would have immediately been labeled a heretic, a dangerous freethinker, or worse, someone dabbling in forbidden knowledge. This narrative suggests that the pursuit of understanding the cosmos or the principles of numbers was a strictly male endeavor, a privilege denied and even dangerous for a woman. Yet, a closer examination of the historical record reveals a surprising number of medieval women who engaged with these very subjects, often with the full support of their communities or religious orders. It is important to remember that the concept of science in the Middle Ages was not separated from theology and philosophy as it is today. Natural philosophy, the study of the natural world, was often considered a pathway to understanding God's creation. Therefore, engaging in observations of the stars or calculations of time could be seen as an act of piety rather than a forbidden activity, provided it remained within accepted theological boundaries. Within the cloistered walls of convents, women often had access to libraries and learned texts, providing them with opportunities to study subjects that touched upon what we now call science. Abbess Herad of Landsberg in the 12th century compiled an encyclopedic work known as the Hortus Deliciarum, or Garden of Delights. This massive illuminated manuscript was intended as an educational tool for the nuns of her convent. It contained not only theological and philosophical texts, but also astronomical diagrams, medicinal recipes, and discussions of natural phenomena. Her work demonstrated a keen interest in the order of the cosmos and the natural world, a pursuit that was considered valuable for intellectual and spiritual development within her community, not a dangerous deviation. Noblewomen, too, sometimes engaged in intellectual pursuits that skirted the edges of what might be considered scientific study. They might patronize scholars who dealt with these subjects, or even engage in discussions themselves. While formal university education in fields like astronomy or advanced mathematics was restricted to men, wealthy women could hire tutors or learn from the learned men in their households or courts. The wife of a ruler or a powerful baroness would often have an understanding of practical arithmetic for estate management, and potentially an interest in the heavens, which were seen as influencing earthly events. One remarkable example of a woman engaging with a form of applied science is Trotula of Salerno, a legendary figure associated with the famous medical school of Salerno in southern Italy, active around the 11th or 12th century. While her exact identity and the precise authorship of all texts attributed to her are debated, the Trotula collection of medical treatises on women's health was widely circulated and highly influential throughout Europe for centuries. These texts describe gynecological conditions, childbirth practices, and remedies, relying on observation and systematic description, a form of empirical investigation that foreshadowed later scientific methods. This practical knowledge, deeply rooted in the female body and its functions, was not seen as forbidden, but as essential, passed down through generations of female practitioners, and eventually codified in written form. Even in the more abstract realms, some women showed an interest. While direct evidence of medieval women making groundbreaking astronomical discoveries is rare, it is largely due to the structured male-dominated academic institutions where such discoveries were made and recorded. It does not mean that individual women did not observe the stars, understand basic calendrical calculations, or have an appreciation for the order of the universe. For instance, the calculation of the date of Easter, a crucial annual event, involved complex astronomical and mathematical understanding. While typically carried out by male clerics, the practical application of the calendar and the understanding of its intricacies would have been part of the knowledge base for some educated women, particularly those involved in religious administration. The key distinction often lies in the purpose and context of the knowledge. If astronomical knowledge was used for astrological divination, which the church largely condemned as superstitious or demonic, then it could indeed be seen as forbidden. However, the study of the stars for timekeeping, navigation, or simply understanding God's creation was often acceptable. The medieval women who engaged with these forms of science did so within accepted frameworks, whether through the practical application of medical knowledge, the intellectual pursuits fostered in convents, or the learned environment of aristocratic courts. Their interest in the cosmos, or the principles of numbers, was rarely a pathway to accusations of heresy, but rather a reflection of their engagement with the broader intellectual currents of their time. The idea that such curiosity was automatically dangerous is largely unfounded, overlooking the genuine intellectual contributions and interests of women in a fascinating era. Number 3, the trusted hands. Why midwives were more than just accused figures in medieval Europe. A haunting narrative suggests that medieval midwives, the women at the very front lines of life's most vulnerable moments, were constantly under suspicion, often accused of infanticide, performing dark rituals with newborns, or engaging in witchcraft. This image positions them as figures of fear and distrust, their crucial work overshadowed by the shadow of malevolent intent. However, a deeper look into the medieval world reveals a far more complex and generally respected role for midwives, who were indispensable and often highly trusted members of their communities. For the vast majority of medieval women, childbirth was a perilous journey, often undertaken in the confines of their own homes. In this intensely personal and vulnerable moment, the midwife was not just a medical practitioner, but a crucial companion, a source of comfort, wisdom, and practical assistance. She was the one who understood the mechanics of birth, knew traditional remedies to ease pain or speed labor, and had the experience to recognize complications. Her presence was universally desired and essential. Midwives were deeply integrated into the social and religious fabric of their communities. They were often older, experienced women known for their skill, discretion, and piety. In many places, their role even extended beyond delivery. They might perform emergency baptisms if a newborn was in danger of death, ensuring the child's soul would go to heaven. This sacred duty, entrusted to them by the church and community, underscores the high level of trust placed in them. A woman performing such a solemn rite was clearly not seen as a demonic agent. Far from being universally suspected, midwives in many cities began to gain a degree of formal recognition and regulation during the later Middle Ages. For instance, in cities like Nuremberg, Strasbourg, and Cologne, records show that midwives were sometimes licensed by city councils or ecclesiastical authorities. They had to undergo examinations to prove their competence and good moral character. This licensing was a way to ensure quality care and public safety, but it also elevated their status and formalized their professional role. A licensed midwife, recognized by civic authorities, was a respected professional, not an outcast operating in the shadows. Accusations of infanticide against midwives were incredibly rare and isolated incidents, usually arising from specific tragic circumstances or personal grudges rather than a general societal suspicion. Infanticide was a serious crime, and if a midwife was suspected, it would be due to specific evidence or testimony, not simply because of her profession. The overwhelming demand for her services, coupled with the vital role she played in preserving life, made it highly improbable that a community would systematically distrust or suspect all its midwives. The narratives connecting midwives to witchcraft often emerged in the context of later witch hunts, where the vulnerable position of women and the anxieties surrounding birth and death sometimes intersected with superstitious beliefs. If a difficult birth resulted in a stillbirth or the death of the mother, and no clear medical explanation was available, sometimes the blame could fall on the midwife, especially if she was already an unpopular figure in the community. However, this was the exception, not the rule. The vast majority of medieval midwives went about their crucial work without such dire accusations. Their knowledge was not forbidden, but highly practical and sought after. They understood the properties of certain herbs to aid labor, the importance of hygiene during delivery, and the techniques for managing complicated presentations. This specialized knowledge, passed down through generations of women, was a cornerstone of medieval healthcare. Far from being feared for their wisdom, they were depended upon for it. The image of the medieval midwife as a universally accused figure is a misunderstanding overshadowing the thousands of compassionate, skilled women who, with their trusted hands, brought new life into the world, day after day, year after year. Their legacy is one of indispensable service, not pervasive suspicion. Number 2, the pen and the parchment unveiling the medieval women who wrote their own story. It is a common misconception that medieval women were largely voiceless, excluded from the world of writing, and that any attempt to put pen to parchment would have been met with scorn or even persecution for defying established gender roles. The pervasive image is one of women confined to domestic duties, their thoughts unrecorded, their narratives unheard. Yet, the historical record tells a different story, revealing a vibrant landscape where numerous medieval women, from various social strata, actively engaged in writing, copying, patronizing, and even shaping the literary and intellectual output of their time. They truly wrote their own story. The most prolific female writers of the Middle Ages were often found within the walls of convents. These religious houses provided not only literacy education, but also a supportive environment for intellectual and creative endeavors. Nuns were trained to read and write, primarily for devotional purposes, but many extended these skills to scholarly pursuits and original composition. Figures like Hrotsvita of Gandersheim, an Ottonian canoness from the 10th century, composed sophisticated Latin dramas and epic poems, demonstrating a deep engagement with classical literature while infusing it with Christian themes. Her works were studied and admired, not hidden away in fear of persecution. Moving into the 12th century, Hildegard of Bingen stands as a monumental example. A German abbess, visionary, composer, philosopher, and medical writer, Hildegard produced an extraordinary body of work. Her spiritual visions, recorded in books like Civias, were profound theological treatises. She corresponded with emperors and popes, her voice carrying significant moral and intellectual authority. Her medical and scientific writings, such as Physica and Causae et Curae, detailed the natural world and human health. Far from being persecuted for her extensive literary output and intellectual ambition, she was revered, consulted, and even canonized. Later in the medieval period, the rise of vernacular literature opened new avenues for female writers outside of convents. While Latin remained the language of scholarship, texts written in everyday languages, like French, English, or German, allowed a broader audience to engage with literature. Christine de Pizan, living in late 14th and early 15th century France, is perhaps the most famous example of a professional woman writer. Widowed early, she supported her family entirely through her pen, writing for noble patrons. Her works, including the Book of the City of Ladies and the Book of Deeds of Arms and of Chivalry, challenged misogynistic stereotypes, offered political commentary, and engaged with philosophy and history. She was a public intellectual, not a hidden rebel, demonstrating that a woman could not only write but also command respect and earn a living through her literary talent. Noblewomen were often significant patrons of literature and art, commissioning manuscripts, employing scribes, and even dictating their own letters or spiritual reflections. Eleanor of Aquitaine, as mentioned before, supported troubadours and poets, fostering a vibrant literary culture in her court. Marie de France, a 12th century poet, wrote popular lays and fables in Anglo-Norman French, works that continue to be studied today. Her identity remains somewhat mysterious, but her existence proves that women were creating imaginative and enduring literature. Even among women of lesser social standing, literacy was not unheard of, especially in urban areas or among women involved in religious reform movements. Marjorie Kempe, a 15th century English mystic, dictated her spiritual autobiography, The Book of Marjorie Kempe. While her public displays of piety and unique spiritual experiences sometimes led to accusations of heresy, the act of creating a written narrative about her life was not the core of the controversy. Her book exists, a unique and vivid first-person account of a medieval woman's spiritual journey. The idea that women faced persecution simply for attempting to write overlooks the reality that writing, for many medieval women, was a legitimate, even encouraged, activity within specific contexts. Whether as devout scribes preserving ancient wisdom, as intellectual abbesses leading communities of learning, as professional authors challenging societal norms, or as patrons fostering literary creation, medieval women left an indelible mark on the written heritage of their era. Their pens carved out spaces for their voices, proving that their stories were not only meant to be heard, but also meticulously recorded. Number 1, Echoes of the Old Ways, the ghostly trail of ancient rituals, and why women weren't its secret keepers. A lingering thought, perhaps fueled by romantic tales or later folk traditions, suggests that knowledge of ancient pagan rituals survived the Christianization of Europe, secretly passed down through generations of women, making them the hidden guardians of forbidden pre-Christian practices. This narrative envisions a clandestine female network preserving a magical heritage, quietly performing rites that defied the dominant Christian order. However, historical evidence from the medieval period paints a very different picture, indicating that, while folk beliefs certainly persisted, the idea of a comprehensive, exclusively female lineage maintaining a sophisticated pagan knowledge system is largely a modern fantasy, not a medieval reality. When the Roman Empire declined and Christianity spread across Europe, it largely superseded and integrated the old pagan religions. This was a long and often complex process, not an overnight conversion. While certain local traditions, superstitions, and natural practices certainly continued, they were gradually reinterpreted through a Christian lens or slowly faded away. For example, specific wells, trees, or stones that were once sacred to pagan deities might become associated with Christian saints or miraculous events. Feasts were often overlaid onto pagan festivals. This was a process of assimilation and transformation, not a systematic suppression of a secretly thriving organized pagan religion. The very nature of medieval society, with its strong emphasis on Christian doctrine, extensive church infrastructure, and communal religious life, would have made the preservation of a coherent, large-scale pagan belief system incredibly difficult, let alone one exclusively maintained by women. There is no historical record of established pagan priesthoods or organized temples continuing to function in secret during the medieval period. Any remnants of pre-Christian beliefs would have been scattered, localized, and often integrated into folk Christianity. Individual folk practices did persist, and both men and women engaged in them. These might include charms for healing, blessing fields, or predicting the future, often involving a mix of Christian prayers and older, superstitious elements. A woman might use a particular herb for a specific ailment while also invoking a saint. These were often considered practical remedies or superstitions, not a conscious adherence to a forbidden pagan religion. The Church generally viewed such practices as minor errors or ignorant superstitions rather than a grave threat from an organized alternative faith. The idea of women as the exclusive keepers of such secrets often stems from later historical interpretations, particularly during the early modern witch hunts, where women were disproportionately accused of witchcraft. In these later periods, witch hunting treatises often demonized traditional female roles, such as healing or midwifery, and sometimes linked them to ancient paganism, though without any actual historical basis. This was more about constructing a narrative of dangerous female power for the purpose of persecution than reflecting a medieval reality. Moreover, the concept of a pagan ritual in medieval terms was often vague. It often referred to practices that were simply not Christian, rather than a specific, coherent, pre-Christian religious system. The Church's condemnation of paganism was often aimed at stamping out idolatry, local superstitions, or practices that seemed to detract from Christian worship, not at rooting out a sophisticated, hidden ancient faith. While medieval women certainly played crucial roles in transmitting knowledge and traditions within their families and communities, this knowledge was primarily practical, domestic, or religious, almost entirely within the framework of prevailing Christian beliefs. The rich tapestry of medieval life included local customs and superstitions, but these were largely fragmented echoes of older times, not the systematic, secretive transmission of a forbidden, fully formed ancient pagan religion through an exclusively female lineage. The ghostly trail of ancient rituals, when examined closely, reveals not a grand secret female order, but the slow, complex evolution of belief systems across centuries, where echoes of the old were absorbed or transformed rather than secretly preserved in their original form by a hidden sisterhood.